Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Chrysler of the Institute of International Studies. Our guest today is Stanley Cavell, who is Professor Emeritus of Philosophy at Harvard University. He has taught at Harvard since 1963, where he was the Walter M. Cabot Professor of Aesthetics and the General Theory of Value. He's the author of numerous books, including several on film. He's visiting Berkeley as the Howison Lecturer in Philosophy. Professor Cavell, welcome to Berkeley.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Where were you born and raised?
In Atlanta, Georgia, of all places, until the Depression hit and my father lost his business. And there we moved to where he could find a job with his brother in Sacramento, California. And that didn't work, and we moved back to Atlanta. And that didn't work, and we moved back to Sacramento. And that didn't work, and so on. But when it came time for me to go to college, we were in Sacramento, so I moved 90 miles down the road and came to Berkeley.
So you've come back as an alumnus.
Indeed I do.
Looking back, how do you think your parents shaped your character?
My parent entirely.
Give me an example about both your father and your mother.
Yes. Starting with my father, the pervasive air of the house was that of an immigrant who was trying to find his way in American culture. He was brought to this country when he was between 15 plus or minus 1, let's say. He was not exactly sure of his age. He had been trained as a watchmaker, and he very young, and he kept finding jobs, work. It was a jewelry store that he had that went bankrupt in the Depression. A completely unlettered man, but in love with learning. Always spoke with an accent, which he hated. Loved eloquence, which he didn't possess, except in the form of being able to tell Yiddish jokes. He was famous in our small circle of acquaintances for being able to spellbind any crowd, especially at the dinner table, with stories sometimes as brief as a few seconds, with a saying sometimes that would last 20 minutes. Now, to tell a joke and keep people spellbound for 20 minutes is an important matter. It's an important talent. I mention that about him because my most influential teacher on my life was J.L. Austin, whose philosophy consisted utterly, essentially, in an ability to imagine stories that could describe and make concrete various philosophical concepts. So, though Austin was completely fastidious and an impeccable speaker of English, and my father was anything but that, they had in common this ability to tell pertinent stories. My mother was the artist of the family, and was I think it's fair to say, great, certainly accomplished pianist, the best pianist in town in that part of the States, or I didn't see any rival to her. And one of the burdens I carry is that the thought that she gave up her career as a concert pianist for me. So just exactly what I was to do with that piece of knowledge is something I'm still thinking about.
She made this known to you?
Well, yes, I would say, roughly, though she was extremely loving, very fine, wonderful, interesting mother. It was clear that there was something undone in her life. But she was well known, the most prominent commercial musician in Atlanta, since she played vaudeville on the piano. She was played on the radio every day.
And she also played at silent movies?
And silent movies, certainly. That's a little before my time, but I heard many stories about that.
And what sorts of things did you do as a family? I get the sense from the introduction to one of your books that you went to movies a lot.
We went to the films quite religiously, twice a week, I think, probably. Lots of middle class, lower middle class, anyway, families did. And in those days, something like half of the population of the, or more, well more, 70, 80% of the population went to films every week. And unlike now, when something like 10% or less of the population go to film every week, we saw the same films. So the web of film culture pervaded American society in the great Hollywood years.
As a family, did you talk about movies?
As a family, I have to say, as a family, we didn't talk about movies. It was the level of conversation about film was about the same as the level of conversation now, which is good or bad, thumbs up, thumbs down. Now a lot more is known professionally about films, but it's still one of my sorrows about American intellectual life that film is treated, though of course at a much higher level, and that daily journalists about film know a great deal more films than they would have known. They know the history of film, but still the idea is that what there is to say about film you can say in a column or two. And I wish that the advent of film studies in the 70s had changed that to a greater degree than, as far as I can see, it has.
Now, as a young person, were there any books that you read that really affected you in a profound way that you can recall now?
As a young person, not particularly, except when I read The Count of Monte Cristo. I assured my mother that it was the greatest novel that was ever written. And then when I read Les Miserables, I told her I had changed my mind, and that was the greatest novel that was ever written. Otherwise, I just read the books around the house, and it was an unlettered household. So it was not until, fortunately, it was not until I went to college, really. And the fortunate part was that I went rather early because I was somewhat precocious. So in those days they used to skip you, so-called grades, an absolutely destructive custom, I think. It destroys your social life, if not your psychological life, in both at the same time. But it meant that by the time I was 16 and showed up at Berkeley, I was so dazzled by the conversations that I found going on in Berkeley that it seems to me that I didn't sleep for about 4 months.
Now, as an undergraduate, you were torn, I gather, between being a writer and being a musician. Is that a fair description of your state as you were doing all this?
It's a fair description, especially of the latter 2 years of my life. In the first 2 years, I was completely absorbed in the life of music, particularly as it related to theater at Berkeley. Berkeley in those days had no theater, but it had extremely energetic and wonderful actors and directors. And for one reason or another, it was I who showed up most often and was awarded the rights to write incidental music for the theater. So much of my first 2, even 3 years as an undergraduate was spent composing music either for our annual reviews, skits and songs, or for productions no smaller, for example, than writing the incidental music to King Lear.
Quite ambitious.
What a reasonably ambitious thing.
What years are we talking about that you were at Berkeley, by the way?
I entered Berkeley in 43. Yes. And had enough credits to graduate. I didn't keep track of these things. I would take 6 music courses and 2 other courses and so on. And I just felt this was life. I don't have any plans to graduate or do anything else. But by 1947, I had acquired enough credits and distribution requirements so that in the summer of that year I was told that I had graduated.
Forced out.
Lovely.
But you keep returning to Berkeley, so that you must have really liked that.
I have over the years, yes. Berkeley is the place of magic for me, still is.
As are the movies. We'll talk about that in a minute.
Yeah.
But then you went to New York to a conservatory?
I went to New York to complete a portfolio of compositions to apply as a composition major at Juilliard. I was already past the age of the normal Juilliard student. So in the extension division, they accepted me as a composition major. And within 3 months, 2 months, 6 weeks, I started playing Hooky from my composition lessons, realizing that music was not over in my life, but the idea of spending my life as a composer was over. I no longer believed in what I was doing. It isn't that I thought it was bad particularly, it's just it wasn't me. And I had acquired the beginnings of an education at Berkeley that went so far beyond music that I was catching up and catching my breath and being bewildered and not knowing what I wanted to do. And being in the theater was part of that, but taking courses in literature was another part of it.
And we should note that one of the ways you played Hooky was you did what?
Yes. You've sneaked a look at this, this text where I mentioned that. Right you are. Yes, well, I went, while I was playing Hooky, to at least 2 films a day, and often to the theater in the evening. In those days, 42nd Street in New York was a place where you could see the history of the last 10 years. It was before the Porno Street and before the reconstitution of the street. It was in the late 40s, a place where reruns doesn't put it, was slightly older than reruns, but if you went twice a day for months, you saw an extraordinary number of awfully interesting films with a terrific audience, too, that really appreciated these films. And then I saw the complete theater season of 1947, which means I still could see Laurette Taylor in The Glass Menagerie, which was still running, and I saw Marlon Brando in A Streetcar, still running, and so forth. So I had my fill of a New York experience, as well as my sense of playing Hooky from Juilliard. I had enough of the Juilliard experience to know what it would have been like, but I had wanted all my life to go, and that's what I did. But my father, being an immigrant, said, first you graduate from college, then you go to conservatory. But he wanted to see the piece of paper that saw that I had credentials as an educated human being. But by then, the chance of starting all over or starting a conservatory career was really, for me, out of the question.
So what led you to philosophy?
Yeah. Well, I could give you a cocktail answer to that, or I could give you, or I could say I'm still asking myself the question.
Right.
One way, serious way to answer the question is to say that leaving music was the first enormous, basic, radical crisis in my life. I was bewildered by who I might be if I wasn't a musician. And philosophy is, after all, a subject you might come to in a state of crisis. That's one thing that happened to me in finding philosophy. That I found in philosophy something that not just answered the sense of crisis, but that in some way seemed to me a continuation of what I wanted from music in its precision and in its profundity. Was it an accident? I ask myself whether it's an accident. But a third way to answer that is that if it's a crisis, you still have to find representatives of philosophy who could provide the basis for these discoveries, and that I found at UCLA. I went there on the promise of being hired to write some music for films, maybe, but first you had to establish residency requirements of the Musicians Union. That took a year. In that year I went to UCLA, and I was hooked by philosophy. It had a wonderful philosophy department, awfully interesting people, and that turned out to be it. There are more bumps in the road, but by and large, that's what happened.
This is a silly question, but I'll ask it anyway. What does a philosopher do?
of course, the serious answer to that is they ask themselves that. Mm-hmm. And almost everybody has his or her own answer to that. All the great philosophers have their answer to it. It winds up in their texts that what they're looking for is a definition of why their lives have been flattened or floored, and how it came to pass that to question themselves was how they wanted to spend their lives. And they question themselves and answer themselves in as different ways as there have been the great names in the history of philosophy. Mm-hmm. And I regard myself as, and I regard my friends as trying to find their way among those names.
And is it you're suggesting that in a way that not knowing the answers is part of the game of philosophy, but in fact developing a rigor and a precision that allows you to do the pursuit of answers in a professional way.
Yeah, now the issue of professionalization strikes another note.
Okay.
So I don't mean you didn't deliberately strike this note, but if you say from for the past 200 years, let's say, philosophers have been professors of philosophy. Kant is the philosopher that showed us that you can be a professor and produce great philosophy. It wasn't clear before. Descartes wasn't a professor of philosophy. Locke wasn't. Hume wasn't. Schopenhauer wasn't. Spinoza wasn't. But you could say of them and of their successors either that they attempt to produce a system that answers the basic questions of existence. That system, everyone will say, or something of the sort, has since the 17th century converged on questions of knowledge rather than on questions of beauty or of goodness, though every philosopher has some view of all of these things. Or philosophers can undertake to question all efforts to create a system of philosophy. But in my book, the compulsion to systematization and the compulsion to question systematization are equal human drives. Mm-hmm. And so I question both of them.
And what does it take to be a philosopher? If a student were watching this, what are the prerequisites for doing this kind of work?
Yeah, another question one asks oneself all the time. One sort of empirical answer to the question is that if you have a taste for it, and taste for it is required, mm-hmm. I could put that as a mood for it. You get to a mood where you can only be found by making assertions and finding yourself dissatisfied with everything you've said. If you like that state of being dissatisfied with everything you've said or that's said to you, you're probably hooked already. And so philosophy has chosen you. But I was going to give you an empirical answer to it, and that is when you go to college, it's for some people, philosophy can happen early. It inevitably happens early, but you don't recognize it. That is, questions of the sort of what was the first thing in existence, or what is God, or is there a best thing, a best life for me to lead, or what is love, and so on. You may stay up all night asking yourself these questions, and you may not call it philosophy. Then when you get to college, you learn that there's a name for this. Then if you seek out the people who know this name and who are talking these things, it turns out, empirically, I say this is not a theoretical answer, that those are the people whose conversations you want most to participate in. That is a way to discover this, which means you need to be exposed to these things, one way or another. That's a way to test it. Another way to test it is, of course, we've all asked ourselves that. When I asked my philosophy teachers, I found myself doing this day and night. I said, how do I know if I'm really doing this, if I'm really responding in a way that means anything to these texts or that means anything to anybody else but me. And the awful and the wonderful thing is, there really is no answer to this question. A famous story for some of us is that Wittgenstein, whom many of us do not doubt was an original and important philosopher, asked this question of Russell: am I a philosopher or am I a complete fool? And Russell told him he wasn't a complete fool. But there's still a prior question, which is why Wittgenstein asked it of this person and why this person was credible to him as an answer. So you pick your shots.
You have a large body of work in philosophy, and in our discussion I thought it would be useful to talk about your work on film, which interests me, and I think will help us sort of talk about doing philosophy in this particular context. But could you tell us what the relation of your other work in philosophy is to your work in film, or is there one?
Oh, I hope there are lots. I think for sure there's not just one. You asked me the right question in suggesting that if I write about film, it's for reasons that anyway struck me as philosophical reasons. But the question is odd. Another time, it's another one of these questions that has different levels of answers, and on a different day I might answer differently. But my first writing about film was, well, there are various ways to answer this. I don't mean to stumble, but I don't want to enter more superficially than I absolutely have to in a short time. I found myself going to films less and less, and I wondered why that was the case. It's true, I could answer by saying, well, I didn't have time. At Berkeley, I was teaching 3 courses every term, and I was trying to finish a PhD thesis at the same time, so of course I couldn't go. That is not much of an answer, because for one thing, Berkeley was the best place on earth, as far as I knew, to see films. Pauline Kael had, in those days, started her 2, then 3 venues, small rooms in which you could see film. It was an education. It was another one of those moments eventually in my life when I finished my PhD thesis, when I went every night again and saw 2 films. Odd education, but to be drowning in the material is really the only way, not to care too much what you're seeing. To care a lot about what you think about what you're seeing, but to see everything you can, that's indispensable. And I want to know why. More basically, I wasn't going to films, and I started then, out of this sense of something missing, to write about what is this thing that I'm missing, what did it satisfy that nothing else satisfied. So my first question is, when I ask myself, what's film? Philosophical question, came in the form of what are its differences? And from painting, from theater, from any of the arts, from literature, how is a script different from libretto, all of these questions. And that produced this book that I see on the table here, The World Viewed. But when I said I wanted to be careful, there was a moment before that, which I believe I don't talk about in any of these texts that I've written, that had already given me the sense that film meant something to me that I wasn't able to write about. And that was while I was working on my PhD dissertation. I was, after months and months of writing day and night on that and teaching classes, I decided to let myself, because I was stuck, go to a film. And it turned out that the film was Smiles of a Summer Night, an Ingmar Bergman film. It probably was playing in a real theater, in a commercial theater. And it was, it may have been my first, first Bergman film. I'm not sure. I had just become aware of the Godard film, the Fellini films that were beginning to emerge, and I was fascinated. They started putting a perspective on the films that I'd seen. Everything seemed to me undergoing change by them. But the effect in particular that Smiles of a Summer Night had on me was that I went back to my pathetic digs and wrote about Smiles of a Summer Night all night long, when I should have been writing about trying to add a couple of pages to my dissertation. But it wouldn't leave me alone. And after a night of that, I had, I don't know, some thousands of words, none of which I ever published. But they were the moment at which I recognized something that it seems to me I've known about the other arts since before I could talk. I could read music, it seems to me, before I could, as I recall it, before I could read words. And I'd known since then that in the arts, everything matters. This was the first time that I'd had the experience of a film in which I had the absolute knowledge that everything that went on in that film mattered. So that what writing about it meant was to discover why each frame was the way it was, why each gesture, why each posture was the same as it was, and why each word was said not just as it was, but where it was, by whom it was said, in that light and with that background. And so, true or false, illusion or not, that was my experience of what knowing a film was. And by the time some 8 years later, in another country, I had by then moved back to Cambridge, this sense that I wasn't going to films, even newer films, came over me. It was with that sense that this is what I needed to discover for myself.
In one of your essays, you're talking about Buster Keaton, and you're talking about how movies give us a capacity to see, and then you say, every motion, in particular every human posture and gesture, however glancing, has its poetry, or you may say its lucidity. And I guess that's what you're suggesting happened to you when you went to this
Good
work?
for you. Yes, that is the sort of experience that I was having. And what I would have meant by saying has its own, well, the quotation, I'm not going to say anything better than, has its own poetry and where to characterize that poetry means to say something lucid. This is an old Emersonian moment of mine. It is Emerson has a crack that when I read it, I thought, yeah, that's something I want from writing philosophy. He says you need always to look for the gleam of light, the little, the spark, what else does he call it? Before, not instinct, sometimes he calls it, but the main thing is intuition. And the reason he says intuition is that he wants to go on to say, for which you then go on to provide the tuition. So, providing the tuition for intuition, I could say, that's what I would like both philosophy and to be about, and to do. And it's certainly what I wanted writing about film to do.
You also write somewhere else, and I didn't write the source, but you said, I understand philosophy as a willingness to think not about something other than what ordinary human beings think about, but rather to think undistractedly about things that ordinary human beings cannot help thinking about.
Yes, I the difference, the difference in all of these characterizations is that they're all to specific doubts and specific questions about philosophy. In a certain mood, if you ask me what philosophy is, I could answer, it's to think undistractedly about what we can't help thinking about. That's an answer, but it's not an answer I would give to, for example, why do you write about film? Or why do you write philosophically about film? Or what's the relation of your experience to philosophy? How faithful do you have to be to your experience? Do you want to preserve your experience, transcend your experience? So I'm glad for these things. I've been noticing in one of my favorite texts in the world, Wittgenstein's Philosophical Investigations, he has an endless set of remarks about what philosophy is. They're not endless. My old teacher, Austin, would hate saying endless. He has 47 different, I don't know how many there are, but there are a number of characterizations. Each should be traced back to some particular contretemps that he has had, for which he's asking himself, what's he doing? What's he looking for?
Was it a matter of some controversy that you...
Excuse this hacking.
No, please.
This has been going on for some days. I hope you...
No problem, but Berkeley is known for not only its movies and the power of its intellects, but also its allergies.
It's allergy, is it? I see. Yeah. Well, it's helping. I'm better off than I was 3 days ago, but we'll see.
Was it a matter of some controversy when you, a professor of philosophy at Harvard, started writing about films?
Yeah. It's caused me a certain amount of grief. That's true, but the grief, Harvard's rather a proud place, as Berkeley is, so as Berkeley might, they figure if you're there, you probably know what you're doing. But there was quite a lot of curiosity about it, and I like that. On the one hand, I think that I have wanted film, and I think it may have been a motive that got me continuing to write. I've written much more about film than I had ever expected to. You point to 3 books of mine. I'm amazed by that. That's probably a quarter of what I've written. I hadn't expected that. But what's kept me going was the sense that it was not a question of why I was interested in film, but a question of why, since everyone is interested in film, one supposes throughout the world, why don't philosophers write about it? That was the question that, perhaps more than anything, puzzled, bothered, even provoked me. And one of the things I hoped for is that I would invite, I don't say there aren't any others, but really terribly few. In all traditions, in both traditions of philosophy, either on the continent of Europe or by us, terribly few who take it really seriously. There are in the Frankfurt School of Philosophy exceptions to this, but even Walter Benjamin, whom one always mentions, almost obligatory to mention in the study of film, never wrote a critical account of a film, and he regarded himself as having an aspiration to become, well, one of his aspirations, the greatest critic of German literature, but he didn't have any aspiration to become the greatest critic of film. He wrote some remarkable things about it, but not that. Why not that? And it has not become. So I have wanted it to become a normal part of what philosophers did in their work in aesthetics, for example. That hasn't happened. There are exceptions. It's happened more. I've also wanted it to become something that was more a part of a university curriculum than it has managed to be. Of course, there are now departments. But I didn't want it to be a department exactly, any more than I want there to be a department of books. Department of film, of course, it's not the same, and film is its own gorgeous subject, and the making of film is its own gorgeous craft. And having grown up as a musician, I'm not unaware of what it takes to really become a master or a good apprentice or a follower or a devotee of these crafts. Still, there is such a thing as thinking about film, and it hasn't become as common a practice and as ordinary, which I would have liked to see as it. And that may be not something to deplore, maybe something further to think about. If I could realize that that's the way things are, it's not going to happen, then it may be that what one should ask oneself is, what is it about film that seems inherently illicit? Not really something you do quite in the light of day, but something you sneak in to the theater before anybody quite sees you, or when you're too young, or that secrets are being revealed which you're afraid to reveal. There is something of that shock in film. Film is shocking. We know it, shocking in its aspects of horror, but maybe it's just as shocking in its aspects of comedy. We don't see it.
You suggest in your writings that what movies do through the camera is to focus on things we don't see in the ordinary, and to do that watching in silence. That's very important to your theory, isn't it?
It is. The relation of what films construct for you to see and what we see is simply endless, and I expect there to be further and further instruction about that as writing about film goes on. You can't help thinking about that.
I want to get a handle on why you went through this door. And in one of your introductory essays, you say that your father always said that you could learn something from everybody, on the one hand. And so that points us to an understanding of why you could find significance in what appeared to be very ordinary. But you also talk about this American cultural tradition, which is one in which there isn't a high culture established in the way it is in Europe, and there is a movement between high and low culture. Both of these suggest to me reasons why you went through this door of film. Is that fair?
Yes, sure, it's fair. It's fair. I'm an American kid, and so I went to the Saturday afternoon movies, as American kids in my day did. And it's I want to answer at various levels about this again. That it is a feature of American culture, that it has produced two of the most admired, treasured forms of art that can be called something less than high art, but which really have served to question the distinction between high and low art, are, after all, movies and jazz. And American film has made its contribution to the world art of cinema, and it has been a puzzle to me that American intellectuals and academics, I include among intellectuals, have not wanted to understand and appreciate that fact. That's one level of answer. I don't want to say that America has established its position in world cinema more than its rights in the high arts of the world, though American intellectuals in some way don't, on the whole, treasure these matters. But why should I say that they don't, on the whole? Some do, and maybe enough do. But it has bothered me that it doesn't play a role in American thinking and not in American philosophy in the way that I wanted to, or had hoped that it would. The other level of speaking about that, however, is that it is that I wanted it to be matters of ordinary conversation and allusion. For example, in professional discourse, in a way that it really hasn't been able to be. If I want to refer to a film in a lecture of mine, I have to think, how likely is it that this film has been seen? And if it's not likely, how much of it shall I describe in order to try to make this point? Whereas, if I want to refer to any novel, however obscure, well, not however obscure, but to one of the great novels of James or Proust or Tolstoy or any of hundreds of novels, and one knows we haven't all read all of these novels, but there's no hesitation in referring to what happens in this novel, not because one would be embarrassed to say necessarily they haven't read it. I mean, there are jokes about who's not willing to say they haven't finished reading Proust, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about whether you're really communicating something or not. What's the feeling? You say it. If you want to go look it up and have a chance or think about it, then do. You don't just say, I like to teach that way, as well as give public lectures that way. I like to say something beyond what students are apt to have at their command, partly to say there's a large world, go find out, partly to say you may not have heard of this yet, but you will, and here you can work your way back and find something to do with it. Film has not become easy in that way. It isn't as though people will feel grateful if you say, oh, you should see this and relate it to these other things, treat it in this way. I'm still asking myself, why not? That is why I think, again, as with films, as with music, as with the arts differ. You should try to see everything as well as hear everything. But I also think, as I've said, you should discriminate and find out which gets to you, and then ponder why. And I don't, on the whole, find as many occasions for that as I would like. So I write books about it.
And let's talk about the two major books that you've written on film. One is called Contesting Tears, the Melodrama of the Unknown Woman, and the other, Pursuits of Happiness, the Hollywood comedy of remarriage. Now, both of these suggest that the two sets of movies that you're studying, and we'll talk about that in a second, really are a kind of important moment in the evolving consciousness of women about their, on the one hand, relationship to men, and on the other hand, about their determination of their own lives and the realization that they don't need men, that they want to go it alone. Talk a little about why you chose these two sets of movies.
We are having the same problem. It's a question of where I dig into this. I think I'll take it in stages. About the more important of the text, the more fundamental is the book on remarriage comedy, because the melodramas, I say, are derived from them. I care about the melodramas, and it's very important what you just said, that there are these two sides to the day, one light, one dark. In the comedies, a certain agreement to marriage is arrived at. It's very ambiguous. In the melodramas, marriage as a possible state for these women is rejected. But the fact that one is derived from the other means that these women are connected to one another. I call them sisters of one another. And why one takes one path and why another set takes another is the subject of both, well, especially the second book. About the comedies, it happened to me, as it happened to so many people in the 60s, that we rethought our existence as professionals, as teachers, as members of universities, as Americans during the Vietnam War. as a part of my incessant conversations with students in those days about everything. The world opened up. We talked about things you would never dream having I wouldn't have dreamed that I would be talking to students about whether they should enlist for the army, whether they should get married, whether they should stay in school, whether endless topics. We were going to movies again together, and I tried giving a course about films. I wondered in my relation to the young how the movies that I treasured when I was young would hold up now. This is after I had started thinking about the earlier book on the ontology of film, on the world viewed, and I had some things that I could already say about film. But now I wondered, how about really choosing the films that I recall as mattering to me? So I gave a course in which, from memory, I ordered a bunch, and I thought the test case will be comedies. If you can share a sense of humor, then you know that the generations have, everyone was talking about generation gap and so on in those days. I thought, well, suppose we could share senses of humor. That would matter to me. So I ordered some films that I remembered, and it turned out that the 7 films, I may be misremembering, but the bulk, at least 5 of the 7 films that survived and formed the basis of Pursuits of Happiness, the comedies of remarriage, were among those I remembered as being the best and most memorable of the comedies that I saw in growing up in the 30s and in the 40s.
And these are movies like It Happened One Night, Adam's Rib.
Exactly. Bringing Up Baby, The Philadelphia Story, His Girl Friday, The Awful Truth. I wanted to, I thought, and then when we screened them, they held up. The students were absolutely involved in them, absolutely ready to go through and talk until we dropped about what was going on in them. This was exhilarating for me, and the more we got into them, the more fascinated I became by them. And then I had one of those clicks in the head in which I saw what they seemed to have, some process they seemed to share, each in a different way. And that is the feature of, not as in classical comedy, a young pair getting together, fighting obstacles to their romance, usually in the form of the woman's father, but winning out in the end, and the comedy closing in some festival, generally called marriage. But on the contrary, beginning with trouble, beginning with threat of divorce on the part of an older pair, where the narrative is to find its way to getting the pair back together, or in the title of, and not great, but still a member of the genre, getting the pair together again. And it turns out that that one difference turns out to have an indefinite sequence of features that differ.
You make the point in the book that this is actually a coming together of a number of factors, both in Hollywood, the generation of actresses that were appearing in these movies,
all born
all leading to a kind of a rethinking of a woman, her role in society, and her relationship to man, which would have also been very relevant to the times you're talking about, the 60s, when you were doing this writing.
It would have been, or especially just a little bit later, when these issues more and more occupy the center of the stage. Yes. I don't know that it was for, it couldn't have been exactly explicitly for me because it was on the social agenda yet. But there I retreat to the more personal. I grew up with a professional woman as a mother. And I knew then that she was not really like the other mothers of friends of mine who were at home. And when I would read that the Hollywood tearjerker or so on were made for isolated wet afternoons in darkened movie theaters, I thought, My mother didn't go to the movies in the afternoon. She was working. So what are you talking about? They can't have been made just for women. So for whom were they made, and what are these films? It turned out that the films that I thought were the best were themselves preoccupied with women of this character who demanded equality with the men. They demanded something that they called marriage. The difference between the women who accept marriage is that they find it. In the melodramas, the women don't find it, and they won't accept anything else. There might be other reasons why they don't want to be married to a man, but one reason is they haven't found any man for whom it's worth it. So what they do is resist society's compulsion to marry. How they find the strength to resist that is something, in those days, is something else. So, of course, it occurred to me to ask, why are the films that I find best in the Hollywood productions? And I'm not the only one who finds them best. Those films, those Hollywood comedies, are beloved worldwide, and they were seen by the directors and by of films all over the world. Indian directors, Japanese directors, Russian directors, Chinese directors, all knew these films, admired them, learned from them, treasured them. The best collection, I'm told, of these films now exists in the Soviet Union. I don't know whether the archive has been opened up yet or not. I'm glad to know that there are perfect prints available. Right. I hope they need to be. But the question, why they should be about such women, is a standing question. They saw something in them. Now, does it have to be, can they only be made by actually casting women born between 1904 and 1911 as Irene Dunne, Barbara Stanwyck, Katharine Hepburn, all were, or are there equivalents? Now you know they're not the only women of this kind. So that's something I take it that you're referring to and saying things came together then in order to make these films. That's right. So a question that comes after that is, do these films continue to be made? Well, evidently they don't continue to be made in that form, so what does one expect of them now? What's come together now? I don't really know how to answer that question. For one thing, film doesn't play the same cultural role in the States now. If only 10% as opposed to 90% of the population now goes to films every week, and they see different films, it stands to reason that what's called a star is a much more evanescent thing than what a great star was in the 30s or 40s, and so on. Not at all to say there aren't absolutely first-rate and wonderful, fascinating films made, but they're not made, so to speak, out of the same mold and reliably, and a certain number every year.
So now we've come to understand why you went to the movies, why you became a philosopher and began going to the movies as a philosopher and thinking about them in that way. But movies are a mass media. So what I would like to ask you is, how would you distinguish the way you respond to movies versus the way a mass audience do? What do movies do to us, and what is the distinction to be made about how a philosopher responds to them?
Yeah, well, I hope to heaven that I respond to movies the way everybody else responds to movies.
Right.
Otherwise, I wouldn't trust what I said about them. It may be that I trust them to be saying something more than most people do. It may be then when a tune gets stuck in my head or an image gets stuck in my head, I figure there's a reason why, and I'm on the lookout for it, maybe, more than others do. But the impact, I hope, is just a plain down and dirty, being overwhelmed impact. To talk about what that is, why they are overwhelming, is a part of an ongoing aesthetic inquiry into what films are, what it is about them, that allows the world viewed as, I think, as much about that question as about anything else. It used to be that you could say it's one of the things about film is that the gigantism of the images, which dwarf you, which infantilize you, which make you speechless. But maybe one can see smaller images now and still have an experience of film. But now there are so many intricacies and technologies involved that somebody's going to have to rewrite all of this for each of these technologies. I think there's nothing a priori about how they transfer to one another. So when I talk about film, I'm still talking about the screening on a big screen and now even what an audience is different from what an audience is anywhere else. That is, I distinguish roughly, just to begin with, one difference between the audience of a film and the audience in a theater is that the theater still feels like the assembly of a city. Mm-hmm. And in a movie, you can be simultaneously two. You can be alone, that's one important experience, but you could be two. And that could be an extremely important audience, the two of you there. And it can be worldwide at the same time. So all this just has to be unraveled, just takes patience to figure out what these things are. And to take individual moments. For example, film can be, I think it was Thomas Mann who was convinced that film was not an art. Various people have been convinced that film is not an art for different kinds of reasons. One is, I'm repressing his name at the moment, very well-known writers, mostly about silent film, an esthetician, whose idea was that it couldn't be art because it was photography, and photography just copied the world. So that can't be art. Well, that's not a very heavy reason any longer, since one doesn't feel that photography copies the world, and so on. But what he was responding to may have been something that Thomas Mann was responding to, that I alluded to, namely that the experience is too overwhelming for it to be art. It's something else. It hits you like what? Like a circus does, or like an overwhelming sports event, or an automobile accident, which Godard almost says in one of his films. So that's not a response that you could really attribute to something that's artful, or is it? Can you make of that something that's ponderable, something that has a sublimation into intelligible, shareable responses, not simply isolating responses of this kind. But to be continued.
On that note, Professor Cavell, I want to thank you very much.
Well, is our time up? Thank you.
Yes, our time is up, and this has been a fascinating odyssey that took us both through your work in philosophy, but also we went to the movies.
We did a bit go to the movies.
Yeah.
I appreciate it. I enjoyed it very much, and I apologize again for the sniffles.
No, thank you, but thank you for coming back to Berkeley and come back again.
It's a pleasure.
And thank you very much for joining us for this conversation with history.